So it always comes down to the same thing as find who you are beyond the conditioned entity, and use the situation of the virus also. So instead of making you unconscious, this challenge, as it has done to many people, it can make you more conscious. Allow the challenge to make you more present. And this is, I've said that before on various occasions, but it's important to repeat because people tend to forget. There is a line that humans reach. Below this line, whenever they are confronted with adversity, difficulties, challenges of a major kind, humans who are beyond this line, they tend to lose consciousness when faced with adversity or challenges. They become more unconscious, they're more reactive, more angry, more irrational. Then other humans are above that line. They encounter also adversity, challenges, big problems, something going wrong. If you're above that line, the challenges that you encounter, whether of a personal kind or collective kind, actually help to make you more conscious. You become more alert, more conscious. Acceptance, you practice acceptance of present moment. You go within, and if the situation becomes difficult, you become more alert. It's like a dimmer switch, the dimmer switch on the light. When things go wrong, the light goes up. Shortly after when I went through an awakening, I was sitting in a movie theater, and I saw a movie that showed the destruction there was some kind of nuclear war in the movie, and most of whole countries got destroyed in lots of violence and explosions. And I was watching that and suddenly become aware that I was in a state of intense bliss as I was watching that. Now, it was a secondary thing. Of course, it didn't affect me personally. It was just a movie. But I found it a little strange. I was already very much peaceful after the transformation. There's always a peace in the background. But sometimes the peace was so strong in the foreground, not only there, but on this occasion I noticed it because it seemed so strange. It was such bliss. And then later on in life, I found out when confronted with a difficult situation or difficult people, often my presence would intensify. And then when the situation subsided, it would go to just a normal level of presence or even just in the background. So when confronted with difficulties or breakdown, it would go up. And then in normal situation, it recedes into the background. So there's this dividing line. When you reach that, you're above this line, then the bad things that happen to you will help to make you more conscious. As long as you're below this line, there's not sufficient awareness yet for this to happen, then the bad things that happen to you will make you more unconscious. For most of you, the bad things that happen now will help to make you more conscious. And the bad things, just to use a generic term, bad, the bad things that happen are extraordinarily important for the total evolution of humanity and consciousness. The bad things are what propel in the evolution of consciousness. That's the weird thing. That it's the bad things that become. It's your purpose is the transmutation of suffering into consciousness, and so the bad things that happen are vitally important. Otherwise, consciousness would not evolve, because the bad things are the dream turning into a nightmare. And then you want to awaken. And so people ask strange things like, why the usual argument for the non-existence of God is, if there were a God, why would he allow all these terrible things to happen? That's a simple argument for the non-existence of God that you hear all the time. And it sounds quite convincing. They say, well, if there were a God, wouldn't he? I mean, this is the terrible suffering that's happening on the planet. I wouldn't allow that to happen if I were God. People say, I wouldn't allow that. Therefore, if I am morally superior to a God, obviously, then there is no God. That's the argument. The departure point for this argument is the image of a controlling figure somewhere, that then this person, this controlling figure could intervene and do things. A controlling father, for most people it's still a father. That is, of course, a complete misperception of what God means. God is, first of all, it is impossible to define what God is. It's the source of all life, a transcendent source of all life. God has no location in space or time. You can never say, oh, there's God. But God, the light of God emanates into this dimension gradually, and the light of God is consciousness. And the consciousness that you can sense in yourself as yourself is the light of God. And so there's a gradual evolution in this dimension. And every form of suffering, at some point, you will realize that it was all part of the birth pangs. This is actually a term used by St. Paul in the New Testament. The birth pangs of the awakening universe is the suffering. It's a nightmare. It's a bad dream, but it's part of the awakening. Out of that comes consciousness. The caterpillar experiences a very unpleasant death before it becomes a butterfly. You couldn't explain to the caterpillar what's going to happen to him. You wouldn't understand. So it's a process of transformation. So suffering has its place, and then it can be transcended and overcome. But suffering is vitally important up to where you reach that line. After we go above that line, suffering still happens, but is continuously transmuted into consciousness. Suffering is transmuted into consciousness. Suffering arises because of the bad things, then transmuted into consciousness. And then suffering is no longer suffering. It becomes presence. Suffering becomes presence. So both in Buddhism and in Christianity, the essential teaching is about the purpose of suffering. In Buddhism, one of the main things Buddha said is, I teach suffering and the end of suffering. There are many things in Buddhism that you read that were added later, scriptures that were written later, attributed to the Buddha, but there are some things that are absolutely so powerful that you knew that's what he actually said. I teach suffering and the end of suffering, which means I show you how suffering arises, and I show you how suffering can be transcended. And what about Christianity? The central image of Christianity is a human being nailed to the cross in suffering. The central image of Christianity is one of suffering. Now, many people say, if you're a Christian, you may, I then still think, I interpret it in one way. Non-Christians often say, isn't that dreadful? I don't want to see cross. Yeah, there is a deep meaning behind it that could perhaps be intuitively grasped by humans who would not be able to understand it conceptually. So if you identify with the archetype of suffering on the cross, the archetypal human, if you identify it, whenever you encounter your suffering, you can participate in the suffering of Christ. In the past, humans have done that and have achieved some degree of surrender and awakening by identifying with the archetypal human that you see. He stands for all humans. That's how I see it. And for the possibility of rebirth, the possibility of resurrection, which is a transformation, which is the shift in consciousness, the caterpillar becomes the butterfly. So let's just repeat one more time the importance of adversity, bad things happening. Use them, use whatever happens in your life when it does happen, and accept, surrender, become more present through it. Any challenge, difficult situations, difficult people, people in deep pain body emotion and so on, be very, very present. There's a saying in the Latin language from Roman times, which it's a Latin proverb. It goes per aspera ad astra, which could be translated through adversity to the stars. Aspera is translated as adversity, but literally it means the rough things of life, the unpleasantness, the unpleasant things, through adversity, anything bad. Per aspera ad astra, through adversity to the stars. That points, there's a lot of wisdom in that saying. To the stars is a symbol for rising above being merely human, rising to a higher level. Very different. Just a different form of conditioning. And that's fine. That's how it is in this dimension. We are all here as persons and personalities, conditioned entities with all kinds of quirks and idiosyncrasies and characteristics, some good, some troublesome, many in fact. If you only know yourself as a person or personality, then you are in trouble. Trouble is an essential part of being limited to being a person without any glimpse of anything transcendent within yourself. And then you're trapped in that. And when you watch movies, almost all the time, that's all you ever see. People who are trapped in their limited little selves and react to things from there and create a lot of trouble for themselves and others. Another word for trouble could be suffering. When you only know yourself as a personality, then this is what the Buddha described as then every situation you encounter and sooner or later ends up in dukkha, meaning suffering, can also be translated as unsatisfactoriness, misery, or simple, plain unhappiness. Even if you have some glimpses of the transcendent dimension, that already is a great help. That is where salvation lies, to use a Christian term. Liberation would be another term you could use, which is Hindu or Buddhist. Awakening, another term. They all mean the same thing. They are pointers pointing to the same thing. And just to have glimpses of the deeper I, the deep I in you, rather than the surface I. The surface I is the person. The deep I is the consciousness. In the same way that the ripple of the wave is the person, the ocean is the consciousness. And you are essentially the ocean and temporarily the person. So how do you know yourself as the the deep I. A moment of cessation of the stream of thinking. Not the cessation of the stream of thinking that happens when you fall asleep, but the cessation of the stream of thinking when you remain very alert, in fact, become more alert. Perhaps just a few seconds, you look at a cloud that just appeared in the sky. And for 2 or 3 seconds, it's so striking that it stops your mind for 2 or 3 seconds while you look at the cloud. And there's an inner response. Oh, something within responds. It doesn't have to be a cloud, it could be a tree, an animal, a flower. And you look and, oh. Then the mind comes back with interpretations. But while you looked and there was an inner response, and you felt somehow, one could also say, connected with it for a moment. Something responded. And later then when the mind comes in, it will interpret it in some way. That's what the mind does, the thinking mind, and it will call it something. It might say, beautiful, that's a beautiful cloud. Or it might say, how pretty. Not the most profound statement the mind could make, but let it be. How pretty. Or it might say, if you're knowledgeable about the history of art, the mind might compare it to some painting it has seen. Oh, look at that Turner sky. Oh, Turner, British landscape and sky painter. Yes. And so you interpret, that's fine. But what you forget is the significance of the first moment of perception and the still space that was there for 2 or 3 seconds in the first moment of perception. That's overlooked. If you can become conscious of, in the first moment of perceiving something, natural things work very well for that. The first moment of perception doesn't have to be visual, it can also be auditory. You listen, there's a bird song, you listen somewhere, there's bird song. And your attention goes there. And for a few seconds, there's a pure listening, and then the mind says something about it. But the significant thing is the first moment when there is the pure listening, because it's not just the listening, because without the consciousness behind the listening, there would be no listening. The auditory organ of perception would mean nothing without a consciousness behind it. So the listening becomes possible because there is a listener, there is a listening consciousness that makes the perception possible. And that consciousness is still in the first few moments of perception quite often. With some humans, their mind is so active that that first moment is so short, it's impossible to even catch it because they immediately comment on everything they perceive. If you find that in your life gradually, when you look at something, you perceive something, you listen to something, there's not an immediate jump into interpretation or labeling, that is a wonderful sign. It is a sign that you are deepening. It is a sign that the deep I is beginning to emerge more. There is a depth to who you are when you are not always immediately judging, interpreting, and labeling everything. that is a sign of progress in your life. That is the arising of, one could call it, inner space. Inner space arises. A certain a spaciousness arises where before there was only clutter, the clutter of your mind. And the identification with the clutter of your mind, which created the person. So that was there before. Now the deepening happens when you realize there's a bit more spaciousness coming into your life. And one of the things, as I just pointed out, is through perceiving something and not compulsively needing to immediately classify, label, judge it, or to have some kind of position, personal position towards it. I like it, I don't like it, whatever. So you let it be. For a moment, you let it be. You become aware of a depth dimension within yourself, the deep I. And the deep I is consciousness. And then you may find that you notice it more often when it happens, because before people sometimes have the experience of depth, but they don't realize it. They attribute it to something else. They have the experience of depth when they look at something wonderful, beautiful, for example, and it's so overwhelmingly beautiful, like a sunset, or some bird song can be just wonderful, or something miraculous that you look at, a hummingbird hovering, and you look at it, you're just, oh. And afterwards, when you talk about it, it felt good. You talk about it. That moment when I climbed that mountain last year, 2 years ago, and it took 5 hours to reach the top. And when I reached the top, there was suddenly this vast spaciousness of the sky and the sun was beginning to set, and it was the most beautiful moment of my life. And I always remember that. I wish I could get that back. I have to go back to that mountain too. But you don't realize that the essence of that experience, you want to call it that, in that moment, it had a time span, so in that sense it was an experience. But the essence of that was that the beauty of two things stopped your mind. The ascent of the mountain required so much focus and attention that you didn't have much time to think about your personal problems. So already, as you were beginning to climb the mountain, it gave you moments of fairly prolonged moments of self-transcendence, because your attention had to be there. There's always a risk and danger involved when you climb a mountain. So your attention had to be fully in the present moment. So the self, the mind-made self, could not absorb most of your attention and think about whatever it thinks about. The attention had to be in the present moment, because there was an element of danger. That was the first thing that started to free you from yourself. Self-transcendence is the transcendence of the mind that creates the self. So already, and then you reach the top of the mountain, it's just one example, and you saw this vast landscape, and it stopped your mind. It was so overwhelming that it stopped your mind. And because it stopped your mind, you had this experience of depth, of self-transcendence. And that was so good. But many people, unless perhaps they've had some contact with spiritual teaching, they may not even realize that is why that was such a deep experience. The deep experience was there because the activity of climbing the mountain and then finally seeing the incredible beauty stopped your mind. It stopped your mind, and something else emerged that cannot be defined in any way. The deep I, a conscious presence emerged that was through which this was being perceived. So it wasn't, people confuse the thing that stopped the mind with that which enabled them to be momentarily in that awakened state, that was the self-transcendent state.